Okay, so you're scrolling through Street View, right? And you've probably noticed that faces and license plates are always blurred out.
Hmm.
You probably don't even think twice about it anymore. But there's a lot of technology and legal stuff happening to make that happen.
A lot going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, so today we're diving into the world of privacy, and specifically how Google blurs those faces and plates in Street View.
It's actually a really interesting mix of AI and privacy laws and some pretty complex ethical things to consider too.
Right. It's way more than just like slapping a blur on an image.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So let's rewind a bit. Like, remember when Street View first came out? It was like revolutionary, but almost immediately privacy advocates were like, whoa, hold on.
Yeah, I remember that there were a lot of people that were freaked out about being caught in random situations.
Right.
Imagine like you went to the doctor's office and suddenly your whole neighborhood knows because they saw you on Street View.
Exactly. It
Mm-hmm.
really sparked a debate about photography in public
Mm-hmm.
and your right to anonymity.
And Google realized they needed to do something about it, so they started blurring faces in 2008 and then license plates in 2009.
Okay, so that was like a direct response to the public outcry.
Definitely part of it, but then laws like GDPR in Europe really changed things.
GDPR, okay, I know it's about protecting data, but how did it affect something like Street View?
Well, GDPR basically forced companies to rethink how they handle any information that could identify a person, even something like a license plate.
Right.
Because a license plate, even though it doesn't have your name on it, it can be traced back to you, so it suddenly became classified as personal data.
Oh, wow. So blurring went from like a courtesy to a legal requirement.
Basically, yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Oh.
But I'm curious, how effective is this blurring system really?
Well, Google did some of their own research, and it turns out it's pretty impressive. They found it blurred around 89% of faces and 94 to 96% of license plates.
Oh, wow, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it is. But even with those numbers, there's still room for error, which raises some questions about, how are these systems being refined and improved over time?
For sure. Okay, so we've established why they blur, but how do they even find those faces and plates in the first place? It's not like there's a team of people just like combing through every image.
No, not at all. That's where AI comes in. They use really sophisticated algorithms, things like faster RCNN, YOLO, and SSD.
Whoa, those names sound intense. Are they all basically doing the same thing, or do they each have like their own special thing?
They definitely each have their own personality, you could say.
Okay.
Faster RCNN is kind of like a detective that meticulously goes through every little detail. It takes a bit longer, but it's super accurate. And then there's YOLO, which is more like a SWAT team bursting onto the scene. It's fast and efficient, but it might miss some details.
Okay.
And SSD, it kind of tries to be the well-rounded detective.
Oh, so a balance between the two.
Exactly.
So if you're Google, how do you even pick which one to use?
That's a great question. It's all about picking the right tool for the job. And when you're dealing with as many images as Street View has, we're talking billions. Efficiency is key.
Oh, yeah, speed definitely makes sense there.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you always want like the most accurate algorithm?
Ideally, yes. But sometimes getting results quickly is more important than catching every single face or plate, especially with the insane amount of images that Street View is constantly adding. It's all about balancing those trade-offs.
So it's like a constant tug of war between speed and accuracy. Too slow, and you'll never finish processing, but too inaccurate, and you risk those privacy breaches.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another important part of this whole thing, training data. These AI detectives need to learn how to do their job effectively.
So it's like they go to AI detective school.
Kind of. They start with general data sets like COSIO or Pascal VOC. These are huge collections of images with tons of pre-labeled objects like people and cars and stop signs.
Oh, so that gives them kind of like the basic training.
Yeah, you could call it basic training, but it's not enough to be a blurring specialist.
So what comes next?
To really get good at blurring, they need specialized training on data sets specifically for faces and license plates. Think of it like going from boot camp to special ops.
I like that.
They need to be able to spot those targets no matter what.
So being able to spot a face, even if it's partially hidden, or a license plate at an angle,
Exactly.
how do they learn to do that?
They use a technique called data augmentation, which is like putting the AI through a digital boot camp.
Okay.
Imagine you take an image of a face and you flip it, rotate it, adjust the brightness, you even blur it a little bit. All these variations help to simulate the real world of Street View images.
That's really clever. So basically preparing the AI for anything it might see out there.
Exactly. The more variations it sees during training, the better it's going to perform in the real world.
I got it. And it's not just about detecting the faces and plates, it's making sure it blurs them correctly.
Right. And that's where the idea of a detection pipeline comes in.
Okay, detection pipeline, that sounds pretty official. What does that mean?
Think of it as like a quality control system. It's a series of steps that happen after the AI detects something to ensure that the blurring is as accurate as possible.
So it's not just detect and blur.
Right.
There's a whole process to make sure they're blurring the right things.
You get it. One crucial step is something called non-maximum suppression, or NMS. Imagine the AI gets a little excited and draws a bunch of boxes around the same face.
Okay.
NMS comes in and cleans up those extra boxes, leaving just one.
So it's like saying, okay, we know this is a face, just use one box. No need to go crazy.
Exactly. But what about those trickier situations, like a face hidden behind a tree or someone's wearing sunglasses?
Right.
The system has to be smart about what we call occlusions and false positives. Sometimes it might have to use a lower confidence threshold for detecting a face. This could lead to some things being blurred that aren't actually faces, but it helps to avoid missing any real ones.
So it's better to blur a few extra things just in case.
It's better to err on the side of caution when it comes to privacy.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say the AI has done its job, it's identified everything, and we're ready to blur.
Right.
What are the actual techniques they use to blur faces and plates? Is there like a blur button they press?
It's a little more complex than that. There are two main techniques, Gaussian blur and pixelation. They each have their own look, almost like an artist choosing their brushstrokes.
I can picture that like in a spy movie where they're blurring out the sensitive info. What's the difference between those styles?
Well, Gaussian blur is kind of like putting a face out of focus. It smooths out the details, but you can still kind of see the shapes there. And then pixelation turns the image into a blocky mosaic.
Okay, so Gaussian blur is subtle pixelation is drastic, but guarantees anonymity.
Exactly. And they can even adjust the strength of the blur depending on how confident the AI is in its detection. So a really obvious face might get a stronger blur, while something less certain might be left a little less blurred.
Well, that's interesting. So they're fine-tuning it based on the situation.
It's all about finding the right balance to protect privacy without ruining the image.
It's crazy how much thought goes into something as seemingly simple as blurring a face, but it's clearly a crucial step in protecting our privacy in a world where we're constantly being photographed.
Absolutely. And remember, this is all happening behind the scenes on a massive scale. We're talking millions upon millions of images all being processed.
It's mind-boggling the amount of work that goes into this.
It really is a feat of engineering.
So how does Google manage to handle all of that processing power and keep the system running smoothly?
They use a lot of clever techniques. One of the key ones is distributed training.
Okay, distributed training. Is that like having a bunch of computers working together?
That's a great way to put it. Imagine trying to train one of these AI models on a single computer. It would take forever. So instead, they split the work up across multiple machines, all working in parallel.
So it's like a team effort.
Exactly. And it's not just about training the model. They also have to make sure the model can analyze new images quickly. We call that inference.
Okay.
They use things like powerful GPUs, and they can even distribute that workload across multiple machines, too.
So they're really trying to squeeze every bit of performance out of the system.
They are, and it's not just about raw power either. They also spend a lot of time optimizing the model itself. For example, they use a technique called model pruning, which is like decluttering the AI's brain.
Okay.
They get rid of any connections in the neural network that aren't really necessary, making it smaller and faster without sacrificing accuracy.
So it's like spring cleaning for the AI.
Exactly. And they also use a technique called quantization, which is like reducing the precision of the calculations. The model does, you lose a tiny bit of detail, but you save a ton of processing power.
So it's all about finding creative ways to make the system run smoothly, even with all that data.
It really is, and they're constantly refining and improving things as new technology becomes available.
That makes sense. But we've talked a lot about the how of blurring.
Right.
I'm also curious about the why. Obviously, privacy is huge. But are there any laws that Google has to follow specifically for Street View?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We mentioned GDPR earlier, but it's worth taking a closer look at how it actually affects things in the real world. GDPR, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation, is a law in the European Union that sets strict rules for how companies handle personal data.
Right. So how does that apply to Street View, where they aren't collecting names or addresses?
Well, GDPR has a pretty broad definition of personal data. It's not just your name and address. It's anything that can be used to identify you. And that includes your face, your car, even your house. So even though Google isn't directly collecting that information when they take a Street View picture, the fact that those images could be used to identify you means they have to follow GDPR.
So anything that could single you out is basically considered personal data.
Exactly. And that's why the blurring is so important. It's how Google makes sure they're following GDPR and not accidentally revealing private information.
So it's not just a courtesy, it's the law.
Exactly. And GDPR isn't the only one. Either there are similar laws in other places like the California Consumer Privacy Act or CCPA.
So this isn't just a Europe thing, it's worldwide.
It's definitely a global issue, and it's really interesting to see how technology and the law are interacting in this space.
For sure. But even with all these laws in place, there are still challenges, right?
Absolutely. No system is perfect, and there's always a chance something could slip through the cracks, a face might get missed, or the AI might blur something that didn't need to be blurred.
So what happens then? Let's say I'm on Street View and I see my house and my car and my face is totally visible. What can I do about that?
That's a great question, and luckily Google has a system for that. They have a problem feature built into Street View, so you can flag any images that you think have a privacy violation.
Oh, wow. So it's like a community effort. Everyone using Street View can help catch those mistakes.
Exactly. It's really helpful for Google to get that feedback, and it helps them to improve the system overall.
That's good to know. But it also makes me wonder, shouldn't they be doing more to prevent these errors in the first place, rather than relying on people to report them?
You're right. And they are working on that constantly. They're investing a lot in research and development, trying to make the system better. But even with all of that effort, it's impossible to eliminate errors entirely.
The world is messy, right?
Exactly. And there will always be those tricky situations that the AI might not be able to handle perfectly.
That's the nature of any complex system, I guess.
Yeah,
But it's good to know they're taking it seriously.
absolutely. And it's an ongoing process. As AI gets better and the amount of data grows, they have to keep adapting.
So it's like this constant back and forth between technology and privacy.
It really is. And we all have to keep learning and adapting as things change.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered the how, the why, and kind of the what now of blurring in Street View, but this has also made me think about other things.
Like what?
Well, we've been focused on faces and license plates, but what about other things that might be captured in Street View, like protests or personal belongings visible through windows, even glimpses into people's homes? Where do we draw the line between public and private when cameras are everywhere?
Those are great points. And it shows that this conversation about privacy is just getting started.
It really does feel like we're constantly trying to figure out where the boundaries are, especially as technology keeps advancing.
It's definitely a moving target. And it's not just Street View either. Think about security cameras, social media drones. It's a lot to think about.
It is. It kind of makes you wonder if true privacy is even possible anymore.
That's a huge question, but I think the important thing to remember is that we still have choices. We can choose how we interact with technology, and we can speak up for our privacy.
Okay, so we're not completely powerless.
Not at all, but
Right.
we have to be aware of the risks, and we have to be willing to ask questions.
So knowledge is power arm ourselves with information so we can make smart choices.
Exactly, and don't be afraid to push back. If you're not comfortable with something, speak up. We have a right to privacy, and we need to defend it.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but we do have a voice.
You do, and you should use it. This has been a great conversation.
It really has. It's given me a lot to think about.
I'm glad, and remember, this is really just the beginning of the conversation. As technology keeps evolving, these questions are only going to become more important.
For sure. So, to wrap up, what's the one thing you hope people take away from this?
I think the most important thing is this: don't take your privacy for granted. Be aware of the risks, ask questions, and be willing to fight for your privacy. It's a right worth protecting.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of privacy in Street View. We hope you found it interesting and informative.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. What stood out to you? What questions do you still have? Join the conversation on our social media channels, and let's keep talking about this important topic. Until next time, stay curious.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and it really shows how tricky it can be to balance innovation with responsibility.
For sure. And speaking of challenges, we've talked about the blurring system in general, but I'm curious about those weird situations, like what about faces and reflections, or faces on posters and billboards? How does the AI handle that?
Those are some of the toughest cases for the system. A reflection of a face is still a representation of that person, even if it's not their actual physical presence. So should it be blurred? Yeah, logically. But the AI might not have been trained to spot those reflections, so it might miss them.
So, like, it needs to be a master of disguise almost.
Exactly. And the same goes for faces on posters, billboards, artwork, all that stuff. Google tends to just blur them all to be safe.
Which makes sense from a privacy standpoint. I get it, but it shows how even advanced AI still has its limits.
Right. The current AI can't always tell the difference between a real face and a painted one, so you might end up with a blurred movie poster on Street View.
Right, which isn't really hurting anyone's privacy, but it
Mm.
makes you think about how we define privacy in a world where images are becoming more and more realistic.
It's a blurry line for sure, and it's only going to get more complicated as AI gets better at generating images.
Yeah, I can imagine. And those edge cases are going to keep popping up.
Definitely. And that's why it's so important for companies like Google to be transparent about their process and to keep improving the system.
Well, that's good. They're not just setting it and forgetting it, but how do they even know what to improve if they can't check every image themselves?
That's where user feedback comes in big time. Remember that report a problem feature we talked about? That's a huge help for Google in identifying those weird cases that the AI misses.
Oh, so it's like crowdsourcing the quality control people using Street View are actually helping to train the AI.
That's a great way to put it. User feedback is invaluable for making these systems work better. It helps to bridge that gap between what the AI thinks it should do and what actually makes sense in the real world.
That's so cool. Okay, so we've talked about the technical side, the legal framework, but I think it's important to zoom out for a second and consider the bigger picture. What are the societal implications of having a system like this in place?
That's a really important question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer. On the one hand, you could argue that this type of blurring technology is essential for protecting our privacy in a world where everything is captured on camera.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly being watched these days.
Exactly. So, having a system that automatically blurs sensitive information could be seen as a way to reclaim some of our privacy, to give us some breathing room.
I can see that, but couldn't you also argue that it normalizes surveillance? We're so used to being tracked and monitored that we accept it as long as it's for our privacy.
That's a valid point, too. It's a slippery slope, and we need to be aware of the potential downsides, even with technologies that seem beneficial. What happens if this blurring gets so good that it can obscure anything considered sensitive?
Right.
What does that mean for freedom of speech or for documenting important events?
It's a lot to consider. It's almost a philosophical question. How much privacy are we willing to give up for convenience or security?
Exactly. And there's no right answer. It's a debate we need to have as a society and one that's going to keep evolving.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for privacy in this kind of imagery?
Well, one thing's for sure, AI is going to play an even bigger role in shaping how we experience the world. We're already seeing it with Street View, and it's only going to become more common.
So what can we do as individuals to protect our privacy as this technology keeps developing?
I think the most important thing is awareness. The more we understand about these technologies and the potential risks, the better prepared we'll be to make informed decisions.
It's not just about trusting the tech companies. We need to be proactive.
Exactly. Be informed consumers, ask questions, demand transparency from companies, and support organizations fighting for better privacy protections.
It's good to remember that we do have some power here. It's not just about passively accepting whatever comes along.
Absolutely. We have a voice and we need to use it.
Well said. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
I'm glad you found it helpful.
I really have. It's given me a lot to think about.
I'm happy to hear that. And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. These issues are only going to get more important as technology keeps advancing.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
Don't take your privacy for granted. Be aware of the risks, ask questions, and be willing to stand up for your right to privacy. It's worth it.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of privacy in Street View.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this episode? What surprised you? What questions are still swirling in your head? Join the conversation on our social media channels, and let's keep this important dialogue going. Until next time, stay curious.
Yeah, it feels like we're always trying to figure out, where those lines are, especially as technology keeps getting better and better.
It really is a moving target, and it's not just Street View either. You think about all the other ways we're being photographed these days, security cameras, social media, even drones. It's a lot to think about. It really is. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly. It makes you wonder if true privacy is even possible anymore,
That's a question that people have been asking for centuries, really, but I think the important thing is we still have choices. We can decide how we use technology, and we can support policies that protect our privacy.
Okay, so we're not totally helpless in all this.
No, not at all, but we have to be aware of the risks and be willing to ask questions.
Yeah.
Like if you don't know how a company is using your data, ask them. If you're uncomfortable with a certain technology, say something. We have a right to privacy. We should be ready to fight for it.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel kind of small when you think about all this big tech stuff, but we do have a voice and we should use it.
Absolutely. This has been a really interesting conversation.
It really has. It's given me a lot to think about, for sure.
I'm glad you found it helpful. And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. These issues are only going to become more and more important as technology keeps developing.
Yeah, no doubt. So, to wrap things up, what's the one thing you really hope listeners take away from this deep dive?
I'd say the most important thing is don't take your privacy for granted. Be aware of the risks, ask questions, and be willing to stand up for your right to privacy because it really is worth it.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of privacy and Street View. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit thought-provoking.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on all this? What stood out to you? What questions are still bouncing around in your head? Join the conversation on our social media, and let's keep this important dialogue going. Until next time, stay curious.